My name is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder. Today is Sunday, February 15th, 2015, and I'm interviewing Margaret Roach Wheeler, who is the featured honor elder artist at the Tulsa Indian Arts Festival this weekend. Margaret, you were a teacher before launching your textile business in 1984, where you've made your mark with one-of-a-kind loom-woven clothing. Your work has appeared in museum fashion shows in a theatrical production, and you've continued to teach and give workshops at Chickasaw Nation as well as overseas. And in 2010, you were admitted to the Chickasaw Hall of Fame. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, thank you.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Sisseton, South Dakota, and my father was in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and School Administration, and so we traveled. I was only there in Sisseton for 1 year. Then we moved to Nespelem, Washington, and he worked with the Colville Agency there, and then to Browning, Montana, where he worked with the Blackfeet tribe at Cutbank Boarding School outside Browning. And we were there 6 years. One of the longest places that we ever were was at Cutbank. Then he moved back to Oklahoma at Concho with the Cheyenne Arapaho Agency and was there several years, and then finally he ended his career at Tahlequah, Sequoia Indian School. So I was raised in a lot of different places around a lot of different tribes, but it was a wonderful upbringing because of that, the educational of being around so many different tribes.
Definitely a great intertribal education. And you mentioned what your father did for a living. How about your mother?
My mother was a housewife. My mother never had a job outside the home in her life. And that was in a period of time when women did that sort of thing. And it was really wonderful for me and what I turned out doing, because my grandmother also lived with us and didn't have a job outside the home. And fiber work, such as crocheting and knitting and embroidery, was done constantly in the home. Mother was sewing, she was making clothes for us. And so I said that's probably why I came up with the affinity. Never weaving, we didn't ever weave, but they had a needle in my hand when I was 3 years old, and I was learning to embroidery and trying to make me knit and crochet, which I was never good at. I said that's probably why I love the loom, because it was a structured, it kept my lines even, where in weaving in knitting I'd have one side long and the other, and my stitches were never good. So, but because I had two women in the household at all times, I think it was a real solid upbringing, and food was important in our lives. And my mother, I said, was a professional housewife, really. She loved it, and she loved to prepare. Everything was beautiful in our home. Food was presented beautifully, the house was appointed beautifully, and she was a beautiful woman and dressed beautifully too. So it was really, that was her job.
That sense of beauty was...
It was. The sense of beauty my mother just carried through our home and gave it to us, So she had an important job, I always felt like.
How about siblings?
I have two. I have a brother and a sister. My sister is the oldest, and my brother's in between. And I made a comment one time when I was speaking and I was where people knew my parents. When I said this, I said that Dad left a child wherever he went. And I'm meaning when he was teaching at Colorado River Indian School in Arizona, is where my sister, who's almost 20 years older than I am, married and stayed. And then they moved to Concho eventually, and that's where my brother married and stayed. And he's 8 years older than I am, 9 years older than I am. And then, then they came on to Tahlequah, where I married, but I didn't stay. I left. They stayed. So I have LaWanda. They both have passed on now, but LaWanda, like I said, we never lived in the same household because she was married before I was born. And my brother married when I was 8 years old, I believe. So just was like being an only child, really. So in sibling-wise, it was. But my brother, I think, took care of me, and I think my sister took care of my brother. So mother had that built-in babysitter before she had another child.
And you've explained your nice, close relationship with your maternal grandma. How about with your grandparents on the other side of the family?
Both my grandfathers died when my parents were children, and so I only had grandmothers. And my grandmother Roach always lived in the Oklahoma City area, and we lived close when we were at Concho, but she would visit us in Montana sometimes, and we would see her. And my father, who was born in Wapanucka, they migrated to Chickasaw, and that is a story that I've just heard recently. I heard an interview with my father that I'd not heard before, and after her husband died, Robert Roach, who was a doctor in Wapanucka, she had 4 girls and 3 boys, but she wanted a good education for her girls. She moved to Chickasaw to be close to OCW, so those girls would have a chance, and I thought that was wonderful to have a widow thinking about where can she live to take care of her children. And so that was new information to me when I first heard that. So they were in Chickasaw, and that's where my father went to high school. And then grandmother stayed in that area around her girls mostly, but they settled in Oklahoma City area, most of them. One went to Montana, and that's the one I get to see. Opal I got to see quite a bit. And if you'll notice, my father's name is Diamond, and all my aunts and uncles on that side are Jules. So Opal moved to Montana, and Ruby and Emerald lived in Oklahoma City, and Jewel had passed away by the time I was born. And Garnet lived in Oklahoma City, and Onyx was in California. So, but Oklahoma City area is where my father's family was mostly when I was growing up. Yeah, but my grandmother Roach also went to Bacone and was an accomplished organist and loved to play. So when she would come visit us, we were all around the piano, and she was playing the piano. And all my family was very musical. I was the only one that wasn't, but my other grandmother played beautifully, and my mother and father did too. So that music and the piano was very important. But Grandma Roach was the one that really loved music and played.
A great mix of artistic influences. What was your first experience of seeing Native art?
Well, when we lived in Montana at Cut Bank, one story Sammy Bullcalf was the name of a boy in the 1st grade. I was fascinated because Sammy had an innate ability. He could draw anything. And I was watching him constantly. And I was trying to emulate him, trying to draw like Sammy could draw. So he was an Indian and he was doing art, so that was real important to me. But the other thing is, very lucky that we grew up at a time that WPA had the artists going out and painting. And so on the Indian school campuses where they would come and paint in some of the public buildings, and post offices always had them. And so here you'd see like an Oscar Howe painting, that flat pattern design that I loved, would be on our school campuses. And so that was really when I just fell in love with that style of painting and knowing it was Indian art. And it was majestic because it was so big and it was on the walls. And so I think our government did a great service because it was in all the post office. You know, all of our public buildings had wonderful art. And the ones I saw, because we were always around Indian territory, was Indian art. And so that was a big influence on me in early age.
What is your first experience of making art?
Well, 1st grade, that's where, and I was so enamored with that ability that I worked at it. I mean, I worked at eye-hand coordination from the 1st grade on. And by the time we got, 3rd and 4th grade, I was pretty accomplished. And then when we moved away from Montana and I didn't have Sammy to compete with, I became the class artist. And I would get to do backdrops for plays. I would get to paint on the windows, and it, I got that self-esteem of being the one that was good and be called on. In high school, I would do the annuals, do the drawings in the annuals, and so it became an identity for me, and it was really, really important to me. It always was. I mean, from the 1st grade on, it was what I knew I wanted to do.
Did you do any three-dimensional work during that period too, or were you?
Yes, as all students in school, they give you everything to work on. And then when I was working on my undergraduate degree, I really went into sculpture, and that was most of my emphasis at that level. And I loved clay, but I loved metal more. And so I had gravitated, by the time I graduated my undergraduate degree, to welding, and I was doing metal pieces. In fact, I won first place at Philbrook in their national show in a welded sculpture piece. And that's a good story because it was 1975, I believe, and I just graduated and I just finished this piece. And it was a dancing warrior with, rattles in his hands and all. And I took it to Philbrook, and you get in line when you're putting your work in for jury. Well, right in front of me was Charlie Pratt with his beautiful stalk of corn coming out of a piece of granite or marble and going up, and then, there was turquoise, and I thought, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? I don't need to be here because I'd just gotten out of school. And he won Best of Show. I won first place.
You won.
So I was, oh my gosh.
That is a great
So that
story.
was great. So that was what I was wanting to do, is get an acetylene torch and do sculpture. That was my love for a while. But I had to teach. And so I got a teaching degree, and they were needing, I was teaching in a wonderful situation, and when they hired me, I student taught there, and when they hired me, I had to go into it was only part-time, and I would go into the classrooms in the morning and watch the three men teach. Then I would repeat what they had taught that afternoon. Their schedule was so busy that I was getting the overflow of students, but they wanted the same information going to the students. So I did that for 1 year, and then these three men that were teaching, they were just great, and said, we need to come up with something else. This isn't fair to you, but it was fair because it gave me the best education I ever had. They were excellent teachers, and to be able to go in and watch their techniques and what they were doing. So it was in ceramics, it was in sculpture, and in painting and drawing. So I was doing what they were doing, who were seasoned teachers, and it was the best education I got. But after a year of that, they then wanted me to come up with something we didn't have. So I went back to school to take jewelry, and I was going to introduce jewelry, but that's where I fell in love with the weaving, the textiles. And so in the master's programs where I started weaving, and so I taught a course called Fiber Metal as I was learning at school. I was also teaching at the high school. So that was, like I said, one of the best educations, and trying to teach, learn and teach at the same time.
Now, you were teaching, watching the three men, and then teaching in what school system at that point?
Joplin.
At Joplin,
Yeah,
okay.
Joplin at that time, Joplin, Missouri had 2 high schools, and I was at Parkwood. Okay. And it was just, we rivaled most colleges. Those men were such experts in their field, and so it was just a great place to begin teaching.
Right.
And learning.
Did I read that you also attended IAIA for a bit of high school or not?
No.
Okay.
No.
So all your high school happened in?
Tahlequah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't know about IAIA.
Right. And you also had a period, did you immediately go from high school to college? Is that right?
No.
Okay.
No. I married Glenn, my husband, who was from Tahlequah, went to Northeastern and was in college there. And we married, we had children, so I was a stay-at-home mom. And then when we left Tahlequah and he graduated, we went to the Navajo. And we were at Loop boarding school on the Navajo reservation where he was a teacher. And I had a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so I started taking courses at NAU, Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. And there's a group from our school would drive in to Flagstaff, twice a week and take courses. So I started working on college courses then. And then I got hepatitis and was very ill, and so after I was out of quarantine, they flew me back home, and Glenn asked for a transfer, and so we transferred back then to Seneca Indian School at Wyandotte, Oklahoma, and I got well enough and everything that I started going to NEO, Northeastern Oklahoma, and I got an associate's degree from there. And then several years went by, and we moved to Seneca, Missouri, and I started going to Missouri Southern. So I've been to local schools wherever we lived. I picked up hours, and it took me 10 years to get my undergraduate degree. And then I taught and then went to get the master's. And so I started, I think I was 23 when I started, and when I finished the master's, I was 35. So 12 years to get that education.
But just really some great, like you said, bits and pieces from all these wonderful places.
Being around different instructors too, on different college levels is wonderful, because you get a variety. You're not at one place under one instructor learning his style only. So it was a great education.
Did you also study under Margaret Schick?
Marjorie Schick. Marjorie was my main inspiration, I said, for where I am today. She was when I went over to take jewelry, she's a noted jeweler, a worldwide noted jeweler. Books are out on Marjorie. And I went over to take the jewelry because we thought that's what we wanted to teach. And it was okay, but it just didn't have an affinity to jewelry. But she had inherited a weaving program, or a textile program. The professor before her taught textiles and jewelry. And so she knew nothing about the textiles, but, knew design, excellent teacher, great motivator. And as a student watching her, she lived in a little bitty town in the Midwest, Pittsburg, Kansas, but she was known all over the world. She would get her work out there, and she made us get our work out there while we were with her. So we were entering shows while we were, working with her. Plus, she'd be at the Whitney Museum doing something while I was a student of hers. She was also the American jeweler who was asked to go when the Winter Olympics were in Norway. I didn't even know they did this, but they have an artist come, they set them up in a studio, and they produce a work during a 2-week period of time of the Olympics. And so Marjorie did that while I was associated with her. So she was a great person to say, you can live anywhere, but you can get your work out there, and you don't have to live in New York or Los Angeles or Santa Fe. And I'm sort of a small town girl anyway, and that didn't appeal to me. And so I immediately then, and she had us put portfolios together, and the importance of a portfolio and making introductions. So through her, as soon as I graduated, I had a portfolio together. I went to every major Indian museum that I could and presented my portfolio, and that's where my career started. So I always feel like I owe Marjorie that push that I don't know if a lot of people get when they go to college, it's just so important to be around a dynamic person that is doing it, and you see them doing it.
And your portfolio at that point would have contained some sculpture as well as weaving?
Mostly, by that time, I was really focusing on the weaving. So that's what I was presenting. I had stopped doing the sculpture. I never did buy the acetylene torch. Never set up that studio. So it was mostly textiles that I was showing.
When and how did you acquire your first loom?
When I was in school with Marjorie, all of my things were off loom weavings. And my husband and I like to build houses, and our first house we built was in 1970. And it had beams in the ceiling, and that was the shag carpet era. And so I wanted a big loom, so I put great big hooks up in the ceiling and hooks down in the shag rug, put poles through that, and strung my warp from floor to ceiling. And that was the loom I worked on most. And I would string warps up turn a stool upside down. Any place I could find two rigid poles, I could string a warp up. So that was my main thing I was doing through school. One of the pieces that I showed early on at Philbrook, that was textiles, because I had left the sculpture, and it was after I had this. So this would have been like 1977, 78.
For the Indian Annual also?
Yes, for the Indian Annual. I got a piece in that was woven, and it was my first loom, but I really bought it for my daughter. It was an S&H green stamp, little two-harness child's loom, and I did a piece on it that I got into Philbrook. And
so it's not the loom that makes the weaving, is it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, because I had woven different strips and then put them together and patted them and beaded and, did all these things to it. But I went to War Eagle for my serious first loom, and it is a craft fair in Arkansas. I think it's near Rogers, Arkansas. It's on Beaver Lake. And I saw a beautiful loom there. And Thomas Bangert was the man who had made it, and he lived in Eureka Springs. And all of the wood he was using was walnut that they cleared out of Beaver Lake before they flooded the lake. So it was all native walnut. And I always talk about it is because Native Americans believe the tools they use need to be beautiful, and that imbues the fabrics that I'm making if I have a beautiful loom. So Thomas built my first loom. And it is with me, and it's down in Sulphur at my studio now. And it's sort of a showcase loom, really, because it's all pegged, put together, more primitive looking than my later looms. It is a countermarch, which is a more difficult loom to string up and to weave on. But it's just a wonderful loom. And so that was the first loom that I acquired. And that would have been like 1979, 1980.
After a number of years of teaching, you mentioned that your husband was able to support you and you decided to go full-time. Sometimes artists will just start showing without opening a business. Were you already kind of thinking in terms of, I'm going to open a business to do this?
I don't know. Mahota was my great-great-great-grandmother that came at removal with the Chickasaws. She was Chickasaw. And along the line, I knew that I wanted a business name, and that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be her name, and because I wanted all my work to reflect my heritage and be Native American. I was simulating beadwork and ribbon work and feather work and in the loom structure, the weaving itself. And so I must have wanted to have it as a business per se, but I never wanted like a storefront. I always knew I would have to go away from where I lived to show my work to sell it. And so, but I didn't want my work hanging on hangers. I wanted it on the body. I wanted the movement of it. So that's why I went to the museums. I was looking for fashion shows, looking for things that we could use mannequins, and I really resisted going into the Indian markets where I would have a rack of clothing hanging. And, Gilcrease was one of the museums I took my portfolio to, and I did a fashion show for them. And that was wonderful. I got into the Wheelwright with their yearly fashion shows that they did. The Heard Museum put me in a show that was called Native Art to Wear. So it was on a mannequin, and it was displayed for 6 months. So from me going out to those museums with that portfolio, I got a show at each place I went. And one of the first shows, one-woman shows I had, was at Anadarko at the
Southern Plains Museum?
Southern Plains Museum. Yes, that was the first one-woman show I had. And everything was up and on display. I wasn't hanging racks selling like that. Then through that, and it was through the Wheelwright Museum, Rowena Dickerson was there at the Wheelwright Museum. And they were doing the fashion show, so I met her through that when I was doing the fashion shows with them. But they were also doing other fashion shows, and they would provide the models and everything. And I know we went to Penn State one time and did a woman of color fashion show. And so Rowena and I became very good friends, and when she left the museum, she got on at the end of the Anasazi in Santa Fe. And I don't know what her title was. It was more than a concierge, in that when people came in, she would plan tours of Indian country for them and would put on events there in the hotel. And so I became one of the 12 days of Christmas. Well, but to go back even further than that, Rowena had just gone on, they were building the hotel. And so the Zimmer group out of Dallas were the ones that were putting the hotel together and going to manage it. And they wanted it to be a holistic hotel, and that they were really teaching about Indians and about that. And so for the first night before they opened, they were having the architects and the bankers and everybody come in, and they had a speaker that was coming, and that was going to be the opening before the official public opening. And the speaker they had hired got ill like a day or two before, 3 days before, because she called me 2 days before and said, "Can you come to the fashion show?" And I said, "Well, sure." So I arrived in Santa Fe like on I think it was a Thursday night. She had all the models ready, and we placed that. The next day, she had hair and makeup. Ray Tracy was our, jeweler, and we did a fashion show for them. And Zimmer loved it, because the other wonderful thing with that, it was artists that were my models, some of them. Emmy Whitehorse, just wonderful wives of artists. And it went over so well, and they wanted me then to be a part of the hotel. So that's why I could go down, I could become one of the 12 days of Christmas with a presentation and a lecture about clothing and Indian clothing, and do a little fashion show. I also would go out during market, and they would give me a fashion show in the hotel dining room. And then I would have a trunk show in my room. So I was not down in the market, but I was there for several years, doing that, because I was still resisting being in the market. I still wanted clothes on the body. But I was also taking commissions, and being in Santa Fe was the most lucrative place for me to be, and there were a lot of commissions, and weaving is slow, and I became almost 2 years behind. So I knew I had to make a change, and I had to figure it out some way. So I quit taking commissions, finished every one that I had promised I'd have something for. And I eventually, people were leaving the hotel after like 5 years, and so it was time for me to move on from that. And I finally gave up then, because I knew I needed to be in Santa Fe, and started applying for the Indian market and got into that. And, so that became what I was doing, was the Indian markets. And I think I did around 7 Indian markets: the Herd, the Idle George, National Museum of American Indian, and of course the Chickasaw, CSAM, and Tulsa, Cherokee, and Red Earth. And so that, I realized finally, okay, you got to hang them on a rack. This is the best way to do it. And I gave up on the fashion shows, So, but long roundabout story for your question. But that's how it all happened.
Wow. Well, I'm really impressed that you, on your own initiative, put together the portfolio, went to visit the museums. I'm friends with Phyllis Fife, and there were a couple of native fashion lines out there, but not a lot. And so for a museum to just, having seen your portfolio, be ready to commit to a fashion show is very interesting.
It was every one that I went to, and the first was Gilcrease, and then the Wheelwright in Santa Fe, the Herd Museum in Phoenix. I, for some reason, didn't go to Philbrook. I don't know why I didn't go to Philbrook. The Southern Plains, but those were the ones that I targeted that I would visit, and I called and made appointments and went in and showed my portfolio, and they all placed me. So it was really wonderful. I was very fortunate, very fortunate. But I knew through education that I needed to look good in that portfolio, and I would have samples of the cloth, and maybe I would be wearing one of my garments so they could see the quality. And it just was the right thing for me at the right time.
What was the biggest surprise in doing the museum fashion shows?
No sales. You know, I thought it was going to be a place where I could really, you know, people come for the entertainment more than I sell very few things through fashion shows. It's more the entertainment, and they're so exciting and they're so much fun, you know, and I love doing them. You know, I love seeing.
They're pieces of theater.
Exactly, and so I loved the whole idea of it, and but again, there were just no sales from fashion shows for me. So I didn't, and the ones in Santa Fe were gorgeous. Sometimes they'd be in artist studios and set up, and, you know, they'd get the models that were wonderful. And so, and also I've got photographs of like Jody Naranjo, famous artist now, when she was a teenager in one of my outfits. And, you know, so I was meeting people through the fashion shows too that were great, because the models out there mostly were artists that you were meeting.
And you used a word that struck me, because you used the word action. You were interested in the action of your clothing.
Right.
Sometimes you'll hear movement.
Right.
But I wonder if you could explain that for us.
To see fabric moving in the air, to me, is so exciting. I do a series, I still do some sculpture. I do a series of poles that I have fabric hanging off of, and my favorite are called the Wind People, and they are outside. And I have one at my home, and it's polypropylene is the cloth I use, which is an indoor-outdoor carpet yarn. And just the other day I was standing watching his fringe. The wind was blowing fringe and the cloth moving. That is exciting to me. Even in my sculpture, I used to try to make, you know, it looked like it was blowing. So it's been a fascination with me to see the movement of fabric and the folds of fabric. So it's just something I love.
What about competitive shows? What was your first major award?
Competitive shows and first major award.
What would have been Philbrook, I guess, but possibly
Yeah,
one for your fashion.
For the fashions. One of the educations for me personally was I love doing the big pieces with headdresses and things like that. And I would enter them, and I wasn't getting any awards. And these were some pieces that museums were looking at, but in Indian market competition, they were not getting any attention. And then about 8 years ago, I became associated with the Chickasaws. And all of my work, because I grew up around Plains tribes mostly, I love the buckskin, I love the beading, I love woodland style with theirs. But I had just never really looked at Southeastern clothing. So when I was down there, I thought, okay, I am now associated with my tribe for the first time. I need to look at our history and our clothing. So I started doing going back through photographs and looking, and in the Chickasaw Journal, their history journal, I found I found two boys in coats that have the real turn-back lapels, large lapels coming back, shawl collar almost. And they called them Chickasaw hunting coats. And I thought, oh, I could. So for the Herd Museum, and this is probably maybe 10 years ago, I'm not sure, I did a Chickasaw hunting coat in red, and I did the turban-style hat. And I had the black feathers on top, like I'd seen from drawings and illustrations, and had a sash, and I did a pouch to match. And I beat the Navajo rugs. I won best of class in the textiles. And it came home to me, okay, this was my tribe. This is coming through me. It's not a big owl or a wolf headdress. That's good, but so all at once I realized that the judges were looking for something that represented you through your tribe. And when I realized that, I started winning awards. Isn't that amazing, you know, that it comes
It
from
is.
that. Yeah. So I always felt very good about it. That was probably one of the biggest things, was actually winning over a Navajo rug. I never thought I could ever do that.
And especially from the weaving perspective.
Yes, yes, yeah. But it was a Chickasaw hunting coat that did it, so yes.
What's the best business advice you got starting out?
Well, the portfolios, of course, for one, and to keep a record. Every show, we started out very early on the master's program. Every show you're in, get the brochure, keep a postcard if it goes out. If there's any photos, hold on to those, keep them together, and then you can put your portfolio together. But if you don't keep the materials, you know, you're not going to have a record of that. And that's what you need, verification that you were in that show, that you won that award. And so always keep that so that you have it for your portfolio. And so that, in the beginning, that was the best. The other thing that when I lecture and I talk to people about starting their own business and all, is photographs. Because so often we are juried by photographs. And I learned that very well from Marjorie also. And I was and this was the early 80s, I was at Boulder at a conference, and I went to a lot of conferences on textiles and weaving to see what other people were doing, and just finding out what the fiber world was, because it was new to me when I started in 77, so I think when I finished my master's, 78 maybe. So I was just grasping for anything to see what the world was about in fibers, and going to a lot of conferences when I'd find them. And I was sitting by a woman. I knew photography was important. And I had taken 2 seminars by 2 different established artists at this Boulder. You could go in and speak to them at this conference. And ahead of time, you set up that this is what you want to do. They set a schedule up, and you got 30 minutes with this famous, it was Randall Darwell at that time, who I had a conference with then, and bring your portfolio in. And they go over their portfolio and they'll talk to you. And so I thought, oh, I would love that. So I did that. And he had seen my work in a little fashion show the night before where we were wearing our own clothes. I mean, it was real informal. And he said to me, I've seen your work. Your work is good. These photos don't show it. And I was having my photographs done by a professional photographer in Joplin, Missouri, that I just thought the world of. He was a good friend. And one of my friends was the model, and I thought they were great photographs. But that was his comment. Then another time I had, the same thing was going on with another artist. She said the same thing, and this was within a month or 2, different conference. And your work is good, but your photographs don't show it. And I hadn't been getting in any shows with those photographs. So at one of the conferences, I'm sitting next to a woman who was from Chicago, the textile, what was the name? It was a store, it was a famous store. And she had these beautiful postcards on her desk beside me, and I said, oh, where did you have those done? And she said, well, they're done in Chicago, and she told me the name of the photographer. As soon as I got home, I called that photographer, and his receptionist tried to discourage me. He said, it's very expensive. And I said, I know, but I want to do this. And I had taken everything, rather than taking it, I'd only taught 10 years in public school, and I'd taken all that money and put it in the bank, and it's what was going to get me started. So I had a little bit of cash set aside for that. So they made me an appointment. I shipped 5 outfits up there, and I flew to Chicago, and they told me to bring what jewelry I could. I flew to Chicago in the morning and met with the photographer. There were 6 people working on that photo shoot. And I was there all day. And when I left in the evening, I had transparencies in one day. The first thing that happened was I made the front cover with one of his photographs, a shuttle spindle and die pot, which is Handweavers Guild of America.
Wow.
on the same piece that I'd had the Joplin model use. And that's still an iconic photograph that everybody that sees me remembers that photograph that's a weaver. Oh, you know, blah, that. And then the second thing that happened with those photographs, I got lots of photos of each outfit, but only 5 outfits. The second thing that happened is with the show that was at the Heard Museum, it was an exhibit. Chester Freeman called me, and he was a freelance writer out of New York, and he had seen that. And he was going to be writing for an Australian journal. And so he wanted me to send him photos, and he interviewed me over the phone. And he liked the interview and he liked the photos, so he submitted to Ornament magazine an article on me. And Ornament's a really nice magazine. And Ornament had another fiber artist that was going to go on, and we were put back like 8 or 9 months before they would do the article on me that Chester had written. But when they saw my photographs, we went in within 2 months. And they considered giving me the cover of it, but I got a full page inside. That's what good photography will do for you. And if you're going into business, pay for it. It took 3 years of me teaching. You know, it was a third of the nest egg I had put back. It's the best money I ever spent. So if I have any advice for anybody and you're doing competitions or you want to be in magazines or anything like that, your photography has to be professional. It just has, and you need to pay for it. You know, now I know what I'm looking for. I watched him, and you know, I had a stylist, there was a camera assistant, there was the photographer. I found out that he was taking Polaroids at that time, and he would fold them up and he would show me, does this look like something you'd want? And I'd say yes. He'd take a roll of film, hand it to somebody that disappeared. I didn't know. They were taking it and having it developed. That was before all this instant cameras like we've got today. Right. Developing it, he was seeing it before he did his final shots of how he could adjust light, how he could do this, what he could do this. It was a professional model. You know, a stylist. They brought out their own Indian jewelry. You know, the stylist was suggesting we do things that I would never have thought of. If there was a wrinkle, the stylist would take it off of her, go press it, put it back on. You know, so I learned, and I tried to watch everything and learn, this is what we need. And now I do have a great photographer that's local. But I'm not good. I don't want to bother someone to take it off. Well, it's got a wrinkle, but I'll try to think, well, it won't show or something. You know. Right. But that was probably the greatest education too, was actually being in a major photo shoot.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a great story. Can you talk about a highlight or two from your experience? Because I think you got a fellowship at the National Museum of the American Indian.
Yes. Atlatl and the National Museum of American Indian were offering these fellowships. And the first time I entered my poles, my Mahotans, I call them. They're tall poles, because that's always fascinated me, and it was the sculpture sort of aspect. But they have fiber on them that I've been seeing. And the Chippewas, I also heard, would put personal items and hang it off of a tree, and that would ward away impending dangers and all. So I love that idea. And that got turned down. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's a wrong story. You got to edit that out. My first proposal, I'd been to China, and it was a real small. There were only 9 people on the tour, and we were all weavers mostly, and we were up in the mountains in southwest China, and learned that it was much like the Native Americans, and that they had been taken to a certain area, and we were with the Miao tribe, and we would go into their villages and look at their fiber works, and we were there also to watch the silk. There were silkworms that did felting, and we missed it, but we got to see the product, and we were just a little early when we went. And but I just could not get over, when we'd go into these villages, how similar it was to Native Americans. And like in Montana, grass whistling with the Blackfeet was something. And when I was growing up, and I hadn't heard it probably in 40 years. And the Chinese, they came out and they were whistling with the grass and the dances, the round dances and all. So I came back, and so my first proposal was the similarities between ancient tribes, and people that had been moved. And I got turned down for that one. And so then, and that's the other thing, don't quit, always try again. So the next time that I applied for the poles, and I used the Chickasaw pole as the story of it and my interest in it, and also
maybe you should quickly just explain the story, just capsulate.
Oh, the Chickasaws, there were two groups of people, two brothers, and their people were behind them, and they would take this pole, and at night they would put the pole into the ground, and in the morning, whichever way the pole was leaning was the way they would go to find their homelands. And there was an argument over the pole, which way it was really leaning, and that's when the two tribes, they broke up, and one became the Choctaw and one became the Chickasaw. And so that's an ancient story that we have. So I've written that, and then I'd also written about the Chippewas and putting personal items on a pole to impending danger. The Mandan poles, they have things, probably hides off of them, but this whole thing of fabric coming off of a pole was really interesting to me, and I got accepted for that one. But they called me and said there are no poles to research. The last one they had been at the Peabody, and it was repatriated. And so could I choose another subject? And so then I went with the fabric of the Mississippians, the textiles of the Mississippians, which was a much wiser choice for me, really. And that's what I got the fellowship on. And this was before the museum had been built in Washington, D.C., so I was really headquartered out of New York. And you got to structure your own program, and then they helped put it together. So in that time I was in New York, we went to the Brooklyn Museum. No textiles there, but I got to see pipes and wonderful things that were from the Mississippian period. Then I took a train up to Rochester, New York, the New York State Museum. Or is it in Albany? Anyway, I took the train up the river and went to the New York State Museum, and Penelope Drucker is there. And Penelope wrote the book on Mississippian textiles, and I had met her through conferences way before she had written the book. In fact, she was working on her master's, the paper, the doctorate, and had sent me her copies of that before she had written the book. So I went up to see her, to visit with her and go over different things on Mississippian textiles. The other place I went was the Peabody. I flew into Boston from New York, and I couldn't get into the Peabody proper because there was a conference going on, and that curator wouldn't let me down unless she was there, but Andover would. So I went on up to Andover and went through there, and they had really some remarkable effigy pottery and things, so it was a great experience there. But going to the museums also in New York, American History Museum, and looking at their artifacts, it was just wonderful. Then finally we went down to Washington, D.C. for the last part of I think it's a 2-week program at that time, and got to go out to the research center, the CRC, and I would walk across to the National History Museum to look at the Spiro artifacts there, because our museum, they were just bringing in the big trucks were coming in, and they were cleaning all and cataloging and everything, so there was really nothing for me to see at the National Museum of American Indian, but I could use the Smithsonian, so I did that while I was down there, and that's where I saw the best representatives of the textiles of the Mississippians, and they were all from Spiro mounds. So wonderful, wonderful experience of getting to get into the basements of these museums and look in drawers and behind cabinets. And then I was fortunate enough, after the museum had been built, they asked all of their fellowship people back to go through the new museum. So I got to go back for another visit and be in Washington, D.C., and I had 3 days then to go through the exhibits and the textiles. So I recommend it to everybody to apply and keep applying until you get it, because the research is just invaluable, invaluable.
And you've also taught a workshop, I read, in the United Kingdom?
Yes. One of the great things about fibers that I learned when I first started in the late 70s is we have a networking that's wonderful. So you have a lot of local guilds. In the past, right now, I'm a member, my active guild is the Tulsa Weavers Guild, and it's an excellent guild. There's the 4 state guilds in Rogers, Arkansas, that I've attended them. Springfield, Missouri has a guild. I've also been a member of the St. Louis Weavers Guild. And there's weaving guilds all over in little towns. Crowder College had a weaving guild in Neosho, Missouri, which was just 20 miles from Joplin. And so you start out with these little groups. And then I found Missouri Fiber Artists, which is not just weaving, it's all fiber art. And I started attending those in the early 80s, conferences with them once a year. And the people I met at that time, we have grown such good friends, and we've done so many shows together, and we're doing another show now in Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm bringing Missouri artists to, we're having a textile show at the Goddard Center next September. I think it opens September 8th, and I curated those shows. And so from that connection early on, we were all teachers, but we all pursued our crafts, and the 5 women I have are nationally known artists now in their fields, and all textiles, but not clothing like I was doing. But so from that, then there's the Midwest Weavers Guild that has a conference every other year. And I became active in that, and they were at Lawrence, Kansas, one of the first times I showed my work in a fashion show. And then from there, from the Midwest, all the difference. There's the Intermountain Weavers, there's the California, there's these weaving organizations all over. And then other year from that is Convergence, the International Weaving Conference, where people come from all over the world. And it's put on by the Handweavers Guild of America. So I slowly worked myself up from little local guilds to state organizations to a Midwestern organization and then into a national. And so I think without that networking, my career wouldn't have taken off in the weaving world as much. And it's very different from what I've done in the Indian world. I mean, my clothing is the same, and I've been sort of the token Indian in those shows. But it was a whole different group of friends in the weaving world, and teaching and doing the conferences. And I know there's one woman in Scotland named Belinda Rose, and she started coming to my lectures that I would be doing at Convergence. And then others from England were taking my workshops, and then would go back and talk about me. So I've been asked back. I think I've taught 5 or 6 workshops now in England and Scotland. And I even spoke at the Battleby Fair, which was wonderful, outside Edinburgh. So, because they're fascinated with Native American. And so it's just been a wonderful, wonderful, in some ways I'm so glad I got out of painting and sculpture and took this on, because it's a path that a lot of other artists hadn't taken. And it's been a unique, and at one time, I don't know if it's true today, but I was the only Native American having a hand-woven line of clothing. And so I had my own little niche. So it's been wonderful. It's really been wonderful. And it's all chance, it's all luck. It's just being at the right place at the right time, but also using what you're learning, and going through it. But the networking was wonderful through the weaving world, textiles.
Yeah, it sounds like such a rich world. You also teach for the Chickasaw Summer Academy and at the ARTesian Gallery and Sulphur. What's valuable about that for you?
Well, they're two very separate things. Chickasaws have the Chickasaw Arts Academy. I love teaching. I love teenagers. And I've been out of teaching since 1984 is when I quit teaching high school. So when I had a chance and I was asked to teach at the academy, I just snapped it up. And so I teach textiles. You're only allowed 8 students, so you get very intensive time with the students. You're with them from 8 in the morning till 5 in the evening. You have lunch with them. So it is intensive. And in that 2-week period, we produce an ensemble for a fashion show. They have to have a garment and accessories to go with it that are all textiles. And we've done some weaving, we've done discharge, we've done dyeing, and garment. And I have a garment maker, which is a computer program where we can create the patterns. And so I'm always searching. But these students, when you get that much time, an individual time with the students, you can really see the development. And Jay Fife just came by to see me yesterday. He won the scholarship that I had proposed that 1 to 2 of my students each year be given a scholarship to Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. And so that we've done it for 4 years now. And that's the other thing, is to see the growth of these students when they can go into New York, go into classes with students from all over the world, because there's students there from everywhere in these high school classes. And so far, every student I've taken has excelled, and they realize that they can compete, they're viable on that level. It gives the confidence you couldn't believe. And Ryan Jordan, who was with me from the time she was 13 to last year when she was 18, is now at North Texas State University in their fashion program. And it's just so rewarding to be able to be part of a program that can offer that and to see these students. And like Jay, this was my 2nd year, this past summer, to have Jay in class. And in that 1 year, to see his growth. And that's the other thing, when they're 13 to 14 or 14 to 15, you see them maturing as adults also, and that's just so rich. But Jay's work this year I thought was outstanding. You know, his whole piece had to do with an Indian living in a white world, and it has to be a garment, and I want them to do something that's cultural. He took a tuxedo and cut it in half, and then put a white shirt on this side. Then he took a creek design, and he cut little, it was on display out here the other day, but he cut little triangles out, and if you look up close, he is machine stitched around, perfectly around, creating this design on this white shirt that's all creek, that's going into the back of the shirt, and then this black tuxedo, and then he's done an armband with designs that are all stitched on, and also a little thing that went in the pocket. Just to be able to see someone that knows that there's going to be struggle living in this white world and keeping your Indian identity, I thought it was one of the strongest pieces. And plus his behavior in the classroom and all. He's going to New York in June, and I take him to the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan. There's always a wonderful show there. We go to a Broadway show that has costumes are the main thing, and try to go down to the National Museum of American Indian in Lower Manhattan and just expose them to art in a big city. And it's been really a great program, and that was all through the Chickasaws and Arts Academy, Chickasaw Arts Academy. Then the Artesian, when they built the Artesian Hotel, they bought an old building across the street and redid it, and it's the Artesian Gallery and Studios, and they have studio space for artists in there to work. Well, I hopped on that just really quick. In fact, I think I moved my loom in before I was told I could. And they were having an intertribal council meeting at the hotel for the first time, and we hadn't even opened the galleries yet. But my room was really completed and all, and I went in and put a rug and put a loom up when nobody was around so that they could see that there was going to be artwork going on in that studio. And I was never called out on it. I thought I possibly could be, because I didn't have a hard hat on when I was doing that. But then now I've had the studio open for a year. We opened last January. In September, I started accepting students and teaching. I can take 6 students. My dream is to create a co-op, a Chickasaw art co-op. And it'll be Mahota Studios at the ARTesian. And we're doing housewares. So I've moved away from fashion. I won't be doing clothing. I'll always have some pieces, and I'll work because that's my love. But main thing is rugs, table runners, placemats, things for the home. Your hand towels. But we've been talking lately, and this is what I'm so thrilled about. I have 5 students, and nobody wants to leave. They want to stay, and they're coming to me with ideas of what we could have there, and that's what I want. I want this to be a co-op where, I'll teach the weaving, but I also want ideas coming in. So we'll have ruanas and shawls and ponchos, and so we will have unstructured clothing. We've decided would be good to have. So it's at this point, since September, which that means, 5 or 6 months, I'm very encouraged that this possibly will make it. One of my students the other day brought a magazine. It's called Selvage. It's a gorgeous textile magazine that comes from Europe. And Phyllis said, "We need to be doing this." She said, "We need to become a community." And I went, yes, this is what I want. I want us to be very high-end Native American things. The Smithsonian has talked to me, but you've got to be a production company to be able to do that. And so I would love in 10 years to be able to do that museums, gift shops will be carrying, the Artesian, Mahota Studios at the Artesian, housewares. That would be a wonderful thing. That would be a wonderful thing. So that is our goal at the moment. And that's what I've abandoned everything else to put, that's the main thing in my life now. And it's being very rewarding.
And you're down there 2 weeks out of each month.
I'm there the last 2 weeks of the month. And we also have a one-day workshop every month in textiles, something that's going on. It was inkle weaving last month. We've done a blouse workshop, making a handmade blouse, and stamping in southeastern. I have a sewing expert that's going to come up and do manipulation of fabric that you could put into your clothing or into your housewares, whatever. She's going to be teaching that, I believe, in April. I had my friends from Missouri. That's been one of my problems, is because I've lived in Missouri and been to Missouri. I know all the Missouri artists, and I'm trying to learn Oklahoma artists textile artists that we can start bringing in also, so that we're bringing experts in. I would like, right now I'm teaching a lot of the workshops, but I would like to bring a textile person in each month that's different, so we give new ideas into the studio. So it's exciting, it's fun.
Sounds wonderful. How important is, we're going to segue a little bit into just some techniques, a little more technical discussion, and then we'll be finishing that. But I was wondering how important sketching is to your work?
I learned, of course, when I was undergraduate, you keep a sketchbook for everything, and I still do. I have my sketchbooks, and when I go to a museum, I'm constantly sketching. Usually it's tribal costumes that I'm seeing, and I was probably better at it the first 20 years, because I've been doing this for 40 years, of keeping sketches. And I go back to those. It might be 2 to 3 to 4 years before I'll go back and see something. But I continually go back to they're my diaries. And now I keep them at each loom. And as I'm weaving, I keep all my records in them, and I have to draw out. My drawing skills have gone down the tubes because I don't keep it up like I used to. But I think it's so important to have those sketchbooks. They're my diaries of what I've done, and I keep the old ones. And And now I'm going back and looking at those ideas when I wasn't that great of a weaver when I was starting out, and thinking, oh, I could redo that now. You know, so I'd like to take my first couple of years and go back and review and redo some of the things, you know, because I have a lot of sketches in my first books, not as many as I do now. But sketching is important. Right. And I've even thought about going back and taking, you know, a class like I used to do.
What's one of the more unusual fibers that you've used?
My basic fibers are cottons and silk wool. Has been the two basic ones, and I have two different companies I order from because I know their quality's good. Then, when tencel started being a big thing, I ordered the tencel for a while, and I love the drape of it. I love the sheen. I love iridescence I can get with it. But I didn't like the longevity of it. I could see it start fuzzing, so I eliminated it and quit using it. I've never used the bamboo. And after the tencel, I've sort of stayed away with fibers because when you're selling a product, you want to know how it's going to last. And when I sell something, I have people coming back that have had a cotton blouse for 10 or 15 years and it still looks good. Well, if I don't know the fibers, I'm scared to use them. But the only newest one I have used has been, it's a Belgian flax that I found, and it's a linen, but they call it Belgian flax. And I got it when I was working on the low-walk costumes because I was wanting a plant fiber that was a little bit thicker and give that more ancient look to the fabrics. And I just fell in love with working with it. It's hard to work with in that you have to keep it damp. I have to keep a spray bottle and damp it or it'll break. And but the finished product is so great, and the linen will last forever. It'll only get better as you wash it and iron it and age. So I love that. But I've not been good. I used buffalo, and that's a whole different story. That's for a workshop. I don't weave with it that much, but I taught ancient fiber workshop. And I would go out and get the buffalo hide. And I found a man then who would pull it. It's better to pull it than shear it off. And he would hang it and let it ripen, and then he would pull and separate the under stiffer fibers from the softer. And then I sent it to have it cleaned, and then a friend of mine in Tulsa, Janine Glaves, would spin it for me. So I have used that, but I've used it in workshops, and we do sort of a medicine bundle out of it, like the Osage medicine bundles. That's in a workshop that I do. It's a 5-day workshop, and the first day is history of cotton through Native American eyes, and the second day is usually the medicine bundle. And then the third day, I've forgotten, it's been quite a while since I've even taught this, but I was taking from different places. We were going to do the corn shuck from the northeast coast, and then I was going to do cedar from the west coast. And who am I leaving out? I'm leaving out one. I can't think. Cotton. Anyway, bast fiber. Just the bast fibers.
Right.
Yeah, the bast fiber workshop. Yeah, so, but 5 different fibers from 5 different tribes is what I was trying to do when I was teaching that workshop.
Wow. How do you handle the tag on your clothing or your Mahota? How do you have a little tag on the inside?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have the Mahota Handwovens.
Sometimes placing that is, or
yeah, no, I just
simple.
do that. Now on these newer pieces that I'm doing, which are discharge, I've made a little stamp with Mahota, and I put it with the discharge fabric.
Right, I think we get to see one of those.
So that I've been doing that, but no, I have woven tags that I sew into each garment.
What's your creative process, starting with how you get your ideas?
Research. Looking at books, looking at magazines. I'm very visual, and so I'm always looking, and that's where the sketchbooks come in. If you don't put an idea down, 2 days later you can't remember what it was you were doing. So I try to keep notes on ideas. And like the piece I'm working on right now is the Chickasaw horse, and it's for a show called Return from Exile, Removal, Relocation, and Resilience, that the Southeastern Arts Group is supposed to be a traveling show. And so I just started reading all our Chickasaw journals about something that had been on our homelands that came with us that is prominent here, that wasn't here before. And I was having a hard time, and I called like LaDonna Brown and people within the tribe that are historians, trying to ask them for ideas too. And she mentioned some of our myths that were brought, that were talked, and stories and all, but nothing was hit until finally there was a whole Chickasaw journal on the Chickasaw horse. The Chickasaw horse was renowned in the Southeast and then was brought, thousands of them brought to Indian Territory. But I fell apart when it came to the resilience because I don't see them, thousands of them here. But then I read that they were the grandfather of the quarter horse, which is the big resilience. So I'm now doing a big headdress of a horse, and it's got beadwork on it and a big cape that I have that'll go with it for that piece, for that show. But that's what I try to do. I was doing a show in Minneapolis for Convergence, realized their state bird was the loon. So I started researching loons, started getting every photograph of loon, figuring out how in the loom I could do the markings of a loon, and did a big piece. So I try to see where I'm going to go, where the piece is going to be, how I can research for that piece, and then how I can do it on the loom, make the weaving work, for it. So I love coming up with, ideas and figuring out how they're going to be done. And I was just talking, and I said it wrong. Kachinas that were out here, I say shalakamana, and I'm mispronouncing it, but it's a Hopi kachina with feathers. And I had drawn the kachina in my sketchbook, and I just kept looking at it, and I figured out how I could form a feather in my weave structure. And so I made that kachina, and it was shown in San Jose. So again, it's keeping sketches, keeping things, trying to figure out how you can make it work. And that's the fun of it. That's the fun of it. If it works out. We're hoping this horse comes together.
Right. Oh, I'm sure it will. Well, looking back over your career so far, what has been a fork in the road for you where you sort of could have gone in one direction and you chose to go another?
Probably the meeting with the Chickasaws was one of them, because I had already established myself in the weaving world, and I was always, most of their fashion shows, I was the end piece, the grand finale. I could always teach, and when you teach at those big conferences, that's where people are there that see you, and then you go out and you teach all over the United States, and like I said, in Europe, in the British Isles. So I was established, and then going with the Chickasaws was entirely different, but it felt right. It felt like coming home. And so it's leaving something that's lucrative, that you're already established in, you could just float on, or taking on something that's really new, going back into the classroom, which I hadn't done for 30 years, teaching students, which I have not really taught weaving from scratch. I go into guilds and teach established weavers, my style of weaving. So having to start teaching from scratch, again, I've really never taught new weavers how to weave. That was, and it was sort of, it's been scary, but I think it's been good for me, but it's also, like I said, I feel like I'm establishing something else that will go on with my name.
Right.
Yeah, so if I can establish the studio to be there long after I'm gone, that would be an accomplishment, So that's what my goal is.
What has been one of your career high points so far?
Oh, well, of course, the Herd Show and winning that. In Santa Fe, winning awards while you're there. That's always good, that you're established if you can win in Santa Fe, win an award. But having a one-woman show, You know, that was a real high point for me. And just being able to do what you love to do is probably the high point of having a dream and following it, and it's worked. You know, I think very few people get that opportunity. And so that's the high point. At this time of my career, is just that I did it. You know, I did it.
How about one of your low points?
Oh, low points. Gosh, it seems like I've had very few low points. Low points is when you get ill and you can't. Like I had Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever about 3 years ago, and for 8 months I was down, no energy, couldn't work. I had to give up shows. You know, I couldn't go to the Herd Market, couldn't go to the Idle George Market, missed seeing friends, and you begin to realize you're vulnerable. You know, you might eat right, you might exercise, but you have no control of that little bug that's going to bite you. So that was a low point for me, is just no ambition. I was so tired I couldn't get up off the divan. Couldn't, you know, and it was also fork in the road. It's where it made me really realize what I've got to do is get this workshop, you know, and leave a legacy if I can.
Right.
So that would have been the low point, just realizing that, I'm in, you know, I can be stopped.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we look at your clothing real quickly?
Oh, probably that I'm very, very fortunate to have married a man that would support me while I did my business. Because all I've really had to do, when you look at it, I am successful, very successful on paper, very successful on paper. But if I had to feed myself and I had to pay rent and I had to pay all the bills, I would have still been teaching school. And my husband has stood behind me and believed in what I was doing, and he's put the food in my mouth and the roof over my head and let me play. And so that's the biggest thing. It's why I'm here today. You know, I said I was given the opportunity to have someone take care of me. And that's something else a lot of people don't get. So I'm fortunate. I'm very fortunate. Lucky.
Well, we're going to pause and take a look at your work.
All right.
Okay, so Margaret, we're looking at one of your dresses here.
This is done with the Belgian flax, and it's a fabric that I love because it's a bast fiber, and it really has a texture to it that I don't see in the wools.
You can really see the texture of it.
The cotton. And so it is a piece that I had done sort of like a primitive dress, Native American dress.
Right.
All tribes had this style of dress. With
Right.
the poncho, it has the poncho over, and then there is a dress that's underneath that's very plain.
It's gorgeous.
And the poncho also has a design, and I'm not sure it's showing in the camera, but it has it's all treadled pattern.
You can see that.
And there's a diamond shape that's real subtle in it, and I love
Oh,
sometimes
yes,
that real,
okay. You can
real
pick it out very
right.
clearly.
I like that real subtle, not in your face design sometimes.
Right.
Pick it up, so.
And abalone shell colors. I mean,
Yeah.
just the delicate
Right, they got a
shape.
soft pinks in them.
Yeah.
And, so it's become one of my favorite fibers to work with. It's a difficult fiber to work with, but I love the final product
It's
in it.
beautiful.
So this is almost like a buckskin dress.
Right.
Like that. And I show it, I have one photograph that shows it with one of my Chickasaw hunting coats and the pouch that's made out of the same type of fabric.
Oh, how neat.
So it's sort of a man's outfit, and this was the female outfit.
Right, and you've got the little design going towards the hem there too.
Right. And it's got twisted fringe that I've become sort of noted for. I twist a lot of fringe. So, but that kind of fringe is more substantial. It won't wear out as quickly.
Right. Okay, how about this?
Well, these are a new line of clothing that I'm doing. Since all the looms are in Sulphur, in Joplin, I've got to have something to do when I go. So I'm doing a lot of handwork and embroidery. And this is the Mississippian flying serpents that we find on pottery sometimes, and they're sort of a symbol. And there's also a myth that goes with them. And I had called LaDonna Brown, when I was working on the Return from Exile, trying to get ideas for that, and she told me about the flying serpents, and that her grandfather was telling her that story that had come from the homelands, but they were telling those same stories here, and that he was up in one of the ponds near their house, you know, and it was this mythical creature. And so that has come with us over the years of keeping our stories. And so I decided not to do this as one of my big pieces, but I loved the idea. So this was a tribute to LaDonna Brown for suggesting that to me. And it's on an organic cotton that I'm getting. It's grown in Texas, so it's very local product.
And a beautiful shade of blue, and I love the way it hangs.
Well, and it's neat, these designs that are coming off the pottery from the Mississippians, and to see so many artists using. You're seeing the potters use them now, the jewelers are using shell carvings. We're really having a resurgence in the southeastern arts that's so exciting. And we're seeing sort of our symbolism rather than so much of the South symbolism now.
All right.
This is my version of a man's ribbon shirt. They've been a fairly good seller. It's woven in ribbon rather than one that's attached. And then the top, I've tried to sort of do a ribbon techniques in the weave structure of it. But I've done quite a few men's things. I do jackets and I do these shirts, and then I have another shirt that I do that is not like the ribbon shirt. Men are harder sells sometimes.
And harder to size, I would think, in a way, too.
Yeah, right. And so I have this one here at this show, and then I have one that's extra, extra large out there, and it's in the tin cell. So this one is a medium, but it's my version of the ribbon shirt. And in it, you can also see, if you look at the horizontal lines going through it, I'm sort of noted for the style of warping that I do. I use 5 threads when I'm warping, and I use generally different colors. They won't all 5. I might have 2 cones of one color and then variations, so that I get this variated stripe, and I refer to it like a painter that's painting. He doesn't take it straight out of the tube, he mixes color, so the eye can visually mix. So with the yarns, I try to do that in a painterly technique. Right. And I also sometimes will change a whole color, like you see the stripe going through later. That's all in the warp. And so that is something I like to do, is to bring my painting and my sculpting into the weaving world, those things that you learn.
Just gorgeous, yes. We have to try to get closer up on that. But I see the 5. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you.